Ethan worked at a small, run-down convenience store tucked in the corner of a quiet neighborhood. The store wasn't much to look at: faded signs, cramped aisles, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. But for Ethan, it was home. He had been working there for the past 2 years, and although the job wasn't glamorous, it gave him a sense of purpose. Most days, he stood behind the counter, his head slightly lowered, silently watching the world pass by. He wasn't the kind of person who sought attention. In fact, he often did everything in his power to avoid it. Ethan was a young man, just in his mid-20s, but his shy and introverted nature made him seem much older. His messy brown hair was always slightly too long, falling into his eyes, which he would often hide behind a pair of cheap, round glasses. He didn't particularly care about his appearance as long as he looked presentable enough to get through the day. He wasn't conventionally attractive, his face was plain, and his features were soft, almost forgettable. But he had a warmth in his eyes, a quiet kindness that few people ever got to see. Most of the customers who came into the store barely noticed him. They came for their coffee, snacks, or soda and left without a second glance. Ethan didn't mind. He wasn't the kind of person who craved attention. In fact, he preferred to blend into the background. Every now and then, someone would make a comment about his quiet demeanor or the way he always kept his head down. But he had learned long ago to keep his feelings hidden. The daily routine was simple: stock the shelves, clean the counter, and ring up customers with a polite smile. Ethan tried to stay busy, finding comfort in the small tasks that filled his days. But beneath the surface, there was always a constant struggle. Deep down, he felt invisible. No matter how hard he worked, how many hours he put in, it never seemed to be enough. He wasn't special, not in the way that others were, and that feeling, that constant reminder of his own worthlessness, was something he carried with him every single day. Vanessa was a regular at the convenience store. She had that loud, overbearing personality that seemed to fill any room she walked into. She wasn't particularly friendly, but she was always quick to make her presence known. Tall, with long, perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed money, she always strutted through the store like she owned the place. People couldn't help but notice her when she came in, and it seemed like Vanessa liked it that way. She didn't care much for anyone else, only herself. Most of the time, Ethan would try to avoid interacting with her. He had seen her come in often enough to know that her mood could shift from casual to critical in an instant. She had no qualms about making people feel small, and Ethan, unfortunately, was one of her frequent targets. It was a slow afternoon when she walked into the store, her heels clicking loudly against the worn tiles as she made her way to the counter. Ethan was sorting through the gum rack when she approached, her eyes scanning the shelves without any real interest. Well, if it isn't the store mannequin," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan stiffened, trying to keep his focus on the shelf. He didn't want to engage with her. He knew what was coming. She had made similar comments before, and he had always tried to brush them off. But this time, there was something different in her tone, something crueler. Vanessa leaned across the counter, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him up and down, clearly unimpressed. "I don't know why they keep you around," she continued, loud enough for a few other customers to hear. "You're not even good-looking enough to be a cashier. It's like they just took anyone off the street to fill the position." Ethan's face burned with embarrassment, but he didn't say anything. He focused on the counter, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. His heart raced as her words hit him like a slap. He wasn't surprised. Vanessa had always been cruel, but it still hurt. He had always hated being judged by his appearance, especially by people like her. It wasn't that he cared about her opinion, but being mocked in front of others made it so much worse. It made him feel small, insignificant. Vanessa's voice grew louder, her audience of 2 other customers now watching the exchange. "I mean, honestly, who hired this guy? He looks like he's still in high school. And what's with those glasses? Did you wake up late for work or just forget to look in the mirror?" She smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort she was causing. Ethan clenched his jaw, willing himself not to react. He knew better than to get into an argument. If he did, it would only make things worse. She would probably make fun of him even more. So, he did what he had been doing for months. He stayed silent. He forced a polite smile, despite the sting of her words. The other customers seemed to shift uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Vanessa didn't seem to care. She took her items off the counter, casually tossing them onto the conveyor belt. "Well, I'll take these and go. Don't bother helping me," she added, as if the idea of Ethan assisting her was beneath her. As Vanessa walked away, her heels clicking louder than ever, Ethan stood frozen behind the counter. The humiliation was intense, and his face felt like it was on fire. He could hear the faint murmurs of the other customers, but it didn't matter. What Vanessa had said, how she had so easily torn him down in front of others, stayed with him. It always stayed with him. And this time, it felt worse than ever. But despite the crushing weight of her words, Ethan said nothing. He forced himself to keep his head down, trying to keep it together. He wasn't about to lose his job over someone like her. So he quietly rang up the next customer, pretending as if nothing had happened, but inside, he was crumbling. After the incident with Vanessa, Ethan couldn't shake off the sting of her words. It wasn't the first time someone had been cruel to him, but it was one of the worst. The humiliation lingered long after she had left the store, and for the rest of the day, he couldn't focus on anything. The familiar feeling of inadequacy settled in, but this time, it was harder to ignore. Despite his self-doubt, there was one thing that had always made Ethan feel alive, something he had kept hidden from most people. Photography. He had always had an eye for capturing moments, for freezing time in a way that made the ordinary seem extraordinary. But the fear of rejection, the same fear that kept him quiet at the counter, held him back from sharing his passion with anyone. The idea of being judged for something so personal terrified him. So, he kept his work to himself, tucked away on his old camera and hidden in digital folders no one would ever see. Ethan spent his nights in solitude, taking pictures of the world around him. He would walk through the neighborhood, capturing images of the empty streets, the city lights flickering, the quiet moments others overlooked. He had an uncanny ability to find beauty in the most unexpected places. Forgotten alleyways, fading storefronts, old houses that had been left behind. His photos were raw, emotional, and breathtaking in their simplicity. But there was a barrier he couldn't overcome: sharing his work. He couldn't bring himself to let anyone see it. He'd look at the photos on his screen, admiring them for a brief moment, then quickly close the file and shove them aside, convinced they weren't good enough. What if no one liked them? What if they were just another reminder of how invisible he was? Still, deep down, Ethan couldn't let go of the dream. He had secretly submitted a few of his photos to magazines over the years, hoping, praying for a breakthrough. It was a small, quiet hope, one he never voiced to anyone. He did it in secret, never expecting a response, but always imagining what it would feel like to be recognized for something other than his appearance. One day, out of the blue, an email popped up in his inbox. It was from Lens, a well-known photography magazine. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he opened the message, his fingers trembling. To his astonishment, they had chosen one of his photos for publication. Not just any photo. His picture would be the cover image for their next issue. It was a surreal moment, one that felt too good to be true. His name would be on the cover of a prestigious magazine, even if no one knew he was behind the lens. Ethan couldn't believe it. His mind raced with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. This was the opportunity he had always dreamed of. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel proud of what he had accomplished. His talent had been recognized, even if it was in the quietest, most unassuming way. This was his chance to make a name for himself, to step out of the shadows and prove that he was more than just the ugly cashier Vanessa had so eagerly labeled him. He stared at the email for a long time, unsure of what to do next. Should he share the news with someone? Should he tell his friends? Or would they think it was just another small victory? Ethan kept the secret to himself, too afraid to let anyone in. After all, he had spent so long hiding behind the counter at the store. What if the world wasn't ready for the real him? So he quietly accepted the offer, his fingers still shaking as he clicked confirm. And just like that, Ethan's life was about to change forever. A few weeks had passed since Vanessa's last visit, and Ethan had done his best to shake off the humiliation. Things at the store had returned to their usual routine. The customers were still indifferent, the work was still monotonous, and Ethan, despite the success of his photograph being chosen for the magazine, kept his head down and focused on his tasks. He was too afraid to let the recognition go to his head. He didn't want to risk the disappointment if it all came crashing down. But one fateful afternoon, Vanessa returned. The sound of her high heels echoed through the store before she even entered, and Ethan's stomach tightened. He had been hoping to avoid her, to not face her again after everything she'd said. But there she was, strutting through the door with her usual air of entitlement. As she approached the counter, she gave Ethan a quick glance, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "Well, if it isn't the store mannequin again," she said loudly, as if everyone in the store needed to hear. Ethan could feel his face flush, but he kept his eyes on the register, trying to remain composed. He had learned to ignore her, to let her words bounce off him, but it was getting harder with each passing moment. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with mockery. "What's the point of working here if you're just going to be invisible all the time? You're literally useless, you know that?" Her words cut through the air like knives. She was even worse this time, more pointed and cruel. Her laughter echoed in the small space, and the few customers nearby turned their heads, not wanting to get involved, but too curious to look away. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The humiliation was suffocating, and the sting of her words was sharper than ever. He could feel his hands shaking as he tried to scan the items she had brought up to the counter. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words got stuck in his throat. This was the way things were, and no matter how much he wished for it to change, he was always the one who ended up small and unseen. But then something unexpected happened. As Vanessa grabbed her items and began to turn toward the door, her eyes caught the display rack by the entrance. The magazine stand. Ethan's breath caught in his throat when he saw the Lens magazine sitting prominently on the front shelf. The issue, featuring his photograph on the cover, was there, glaringly in the open. Vanessa, who had never noticed the magazine stand before, now walked over to it, curious. She picked up the magazine with a disdainful look, flipping it over in her hands as though inspecting a piece of garbage. Her eyes widened when she saw the cover. The photograph was striking, an urban scene at night, a lone figure walking down a dimly lit street, the colors rich and vivid, the mood poignant and powerful. She let out a laugh, loud and mocking. "Look at this," she scoffed, holding up the magazine for anyone to see. "Can you believe this? Someone actually put this ugly guy on the cover. What kind of joke is this? Who in their right mind would pick someone like this?" She held up the cover, as if it was some kind of absurdity, and laughed even louder, as though the whole situation was the punchline of a bad joke. Ethan's heart sank, the blood rushing to his ears. His stomach twisted into knots as Vanessa continued her rant. "I mean, honestly, how does someone this ugly get a chance to be on a cover? Must be a fluke." She shook her head in disbelief, clearly finding the whole thing laughable. "Look at that face. They couldn't have found anyone better? Ridiculous." The words pierced through him like 1,000 needles. His own image, his own talent, the very thing he had worked so hard for, was being belittled by the woman who had tormented him for so long. The irony was impossible to ignore. Here she was, mocking his photo, not realizing that the person she was belittling was standing right in front of her. Ethan stood frozen, the tension in his body unbearable. He knew what was happening. He knew exactly what she was doing, and yet he couldn't bring himself to say anything. He had never expected to be in this situation. But as Vanessa continued to mock the cover, making snide remarks about the photo, Ethan finally reached his breaking point. He stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. "You know," he said, his words tinged with quiet defiance, "that's my photo." Vanessa paused, the magazine still in her hands. She blinked, confusion flashing in her eyes. "What?" she scoffed, not taking him seriously. "What do you mean, your photo? You?" Her voice dripped with disbelief. "Please, that's just some guy who looks like you but not you." Ethan's hands were trembling, but he didn't look away. He took a deep breath and in a calm, steady voice added, "It's my work. I took that picture. I'm the one on the cover." Vanessa stared at him for a long moment, the magazine still in her hands. Her eyes flickered from the cover to his face, and for the first time there was uncertainty in her gaze. Then, slowly, her smug expression faltered. The laughter she had been so eager to share with everyone else died in her throat. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. There was an awkward silence, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. Vanessa's face flushed, and she slowly placed the magazine back on the rack, no longer laughing, no longer mocking. She turned, looking anywhere but at Ethan, and walked out of the store without another word. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. The humiliation still lingered, but there was something else now, a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, he had stood up for himself. And the look on Vanessa's face as she realized the truth, it was priceless. Ethan stood there, his heart still racing, as Vanessa hesitated at the rack, the words hanging between them. He could feel the tension in the air, and for the first time, it wasn't just about his insecurities. It was about something much bigger. Something he had kept hidden for so long, the truth about who he really was. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. "That's my photo," he repeated, looking directly at her. "I took that picture. I'm the one on the cover of the magazine." Vanessa blinked, clearly caught off guard. The smugness that had been plastered on her face just moments ago melted away. She stared at him as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What?" she said, her voice almost too soft, her laughter from moments ago gone. "You?" She looked at the cover of the magazine again, disbelief clouding her features. "No way. That can't be right. This is some kind of mistake, right? It's just a coincidence." Ethan shook his head, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions that were rushing through him. "It's not a coincidence. I took the photo. I'm the one who made it. I'm the one you've been mocking." His words hung in the air, heavier than he had anticipated. Vanessa's face flushed a deep shade of red. She seemed to search for an excuse, her eyes flicking between Ethan and the magazine, her lips moving but failing to find the right words. After a long moment of awkward silence, she cleared her throat, an uncertain smile playing on her lips. "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, I didn't know it was you. I just thought, that picture, it's just... Well, I didn't mean to offend you, all right?" Her voice was now laced with forced politeness, but there was an unmistakable insincerity in her tone. Ethan's stomach twisted, the familiar sting of her words still sharp in his mind, but this time he couldn't let her off so easily. "No, it's not just that you didn't realize," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You mocked me. You called me useless, invisible. You made fun of the way I look, like that's all that matters, like I don't have anything else to offer." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But what you don't get is that people are more than just their appearance. I'm more than just the way I look, more than just what you see in front of you. That picture, my picture, it's proof of that. It's proof that I have something worth showing." Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but for once, she seemed lost for words. Her usual sharpness had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar, shame. She shifted awkwardly, glancing around as though looking for an escape. Her apology was still hanging in the air, but this time it wasn't just empty words. There was something in the way she looked at him, something almost remorseful, though she would never admit it aloud. But Ethan didn't need her to apologize sincerely. He didn't need her to validate him or take back what she had said. He had already taken back his power in that moment, standing up for himself, speaking the truth. And that, he realized, was more than enough. Vanessa took a step back, her face still flushed with embarrassment. She mumbled something under her breath, something that didn't even sound like an apology. "Yeah, well, whatever. It's just a photo. Doesn't matter." She turned quickly, walking toward the door, not even bothering to look back. Ethan watched her leave, the silence settling around him. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. The weight of her words, the years of self-doubt, it all seemed lighter now. The confrontation had been small, but for Ethan, it was a turning point. He had stood up for himself in a way he never thought he could. And as Vanessa walked out of the store, her head hanging low, Ethan couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of triumph. Maybe things were changing. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible after all. After the incident with Vanessa, something inside Ethan shifted. For the first time in years, he felt a surge of confidence, a quiet strength that he had never known he possessed. Standing up for himself, even in the smallest of ways, had given him a sense of empowerment. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and the world suddenly felt like a place where he could carve out a space for himself. With this newfound belief in himself, Ethan threw himself into his photography even more. He stopped hiding behind the counter at the convenience store, constantly afraid of being judged. Instead, he embraced his talent, sending more of his work to magazines, galleries, and art shows. What was once a secret passion had blossomed into a career. His unique style, the raw emotion he captured in his photos, quickly began to garner attention. He started to receive calls from larger publications, invitations to showcase his work, and offers for collaborations with well-known photographers. The day came when he was invited to participate in a prestigious photography exhibition. It was a dream come true. Ethan's work was no longer something hidden away in digital files or tucked into a corner of a local convenience store. His photos were being recognized for their power, their beauty, their ability to make people stop and think. He was finally starting to see the world the way he had always imagined it, through his lens, full of possibilities. Vanessa, on the other hand, was not having the same success. Her once invincible air of superiority began to crack as she realized the impact of her actions. Word of Ethan's success spread quickly, and people started to talk. Vanessa, who had once mocked him without a second thought, now found herself facing the consequences of her cruelty. People began to treat her differently, and she started to feel the weight of her own behavior. She couldn't help but feel humiliated every time Ethan's name came up, knowing she had been the one to belittle him in front of others. Her self-image, built on the idea that she was somehow better than others, began to crumble. Vanessa couldn't escape the fact that she had underestimated the quiet young man she had so easily put down. She had been so fixated on appearances, on power, on being the one who got to define people's worth, that she hadn't realized what it truly meant to see someone for who they were, not just how they looked. Meanwhile, Ethan's story caught the attention of a local news outlet. A feature article about his rise from an invisible cashier to a celebrated photographer went viral. People were inspired by his journey, how he had stood up to bullying, how he had fought for his dreams despite the odds. The article shared his message about believing in oneself, no matter the obstacles, and how important it was not to judge others based on superficial things like appearance. Ethan's life was no longer defined by his quiet existence behind a counter. It was defined by his art, his resilience, and his newfound sense of self-worth. He was living the life he had once only dreamed of, and every new opportunity was a reminder of how far he had come. As Ethan looked back on everything, the mocking words, the isolation, the small moments of doubt, he realized that the most important thing he had gained wasn't fame or recognition. It was self-acceptance. He no longer allowed others to define him. He no longer allowed his worth to be measured by the way he looked or by the opinions of people like Vanessa. He had learned that everyone has a story, everyone has value, and no one should ever be judged by the outside. In the end, Ethan's journey wasn't just about becoming successful in his career. It was about realizing his worth, no matter how the world saw him. And as he stood before his latest gallery exhibition, surrounded by people who appreciated his art, Ethan knew that the most beautiful thing he had captured wasn't in any photo. It was the strength and courage to be himself, fully and unapologetically. Thank you so much for watching Ethan's incredible journey of self-discovery and resilience. His story shows us that no matter how hard things get, we can all rise above negativity and embrace our true worth. Remember, everyone has a story, and your voice matters. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of Ethan's journey inspired you the most? And if you know someone who needs a little encouragement today, share this video with them. Let's spread the message of kindness and self-acceptance together. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for being a part of this journey with us.